The state believes that it is owed 28.9 million rand by Jacob Zuma. This is money that the state paid out and later decided it had wrongly paid it out, and that opinion was backed up by a court to fund his defence against the corruption charges against him. The state said, we're stopping paying because, hey, there was a new president in charge with a new attitude, and now they want that back. There's an application to the court from President Ramaphosa, the state attorney, and the Solicitor General to recover those funds. And Jacob Zuma's legal team has handed in legal papers saying, ain't got the money, sorry. Story on News 24, written by whom else? Karyn Maughan, their investigative journalist with a specialisation in legal matters. Hello, Karyn.
Hello, John.
He probably doesn't have the money.
Well, I mean, what's fascinating about this is actually that this case is the consequence of litigation that was launched by the DA and EFF back in the day, where Jacob Zuma was essentially using untrammeled state funding of all his corruption trial costs to litigate on every point that could possibly be litigated on. And while his his lawyer then, Kemp, had made it very clear that he would embark on the Stalingrad strategy, it was really this untrammeled legal funding made possible through an agreement between the state attorney and the presidency in 2006 that allowed him to do that, but with a very important qualifier that if and when he was ever convicted of the corruption, field corruption that he was charged with, or found to have acted in his own interests, he would have to pay that money back. And of course, the DA and the EFF said, under the State Attorneys Act, it is simply untenable, legally completely unjustified that someone an official accused of corruption would then be given this kind of untrammeled access to taxpayer funding. And the SCA and the High Court, SCA endorsing what the High Court found, which is essentially that Jacob Zuma had used taxpayers' money to litigate on a luxurious scale, ordered the state attorney to quantify exactly how much had been spent, and then said the state attorney needed to, quote unquote, take all reasonable steps, including civil litigation, to get that money back. And that now 5 years, it was 4 years after that ruling, we now have this case finally being in court, and Jacob Zuma, of course, saying, but I don't have the money, and in any event, I can't be ordered to pay this money now.
On the grounds he can't be ordered to pay the money now, on the grounds that his corruption trial has not yet reached a conclusion, or on what grounds?
Well, he's really, as he always does, Jackson Pollocked this litigation, thrown everything at the wall and seeing if he can make a picture. He's argued that, the original agreement was that he should be, if he was convicted, then he would pay back. The government is saying that's not the test here. The court has found that you should never have been granted this money in the first place. He's also saying that he's been unfairly discriminated against, that a number of apartheid government officials had their legal fees funded by the state, all in circumstances where they were, of course, not found guilty of offences. But he says that he should be given that same legal funding. And he says that even if that funding is unlawful, he is simply a victim of poor legal advice, negligent legal advice that was given to then President Thabo Mbeki by negligent government lawyers, and that he shouldn't be forced to suffer as a consequence of that.
I wonder what the courts will think of that argument. But, I mean, his finances are, I think, a matter of some fascination, because subsequent to the state stopping paying for all his trials, he's made so many court appearances, represented mostly by Darling Mpofu, by other advocates and by attorneys. And one wonders what the tally of that legal fee mess is, probably close to or exceeding 28.9 million rand. And I wonder where he's got that money, but maybe from benefactors, maybe they're doing it out of the goodness of their legal hearts and so on. But I mean, in terms of state pension and owned property, he doesn't have 28.9 million rand. So, does the state, I don't know, can the state apply for bankruptcy, or is that a civil matter? Well, what are the possible channels flowing away from this pond in the river?
Well, that's where it gets interesting, right? Because the DA is part of this litigation and it wants the court to compel the state attorney, if Jacob Zuma doesn't come up with this money, to then order the state attorney to attach and execute on his property. Now, of course, he does not own Nkandla. That is owned by the Ingonyama Trust, so that property couldn't be attached. Furniture, livestock, anything of that nature could be attached. And of course, the big question is over his pension. And he said, well, even if you do attach and forfeit my pension, I still wouldn't be able to pay this money back. But the DA is clearly concerned that if the court makes an order and then leaves it in the hands of the state attorney to execute, the kind of lethargy that informed, the 4-year delay between the SCA making that judgment and now this case finally being in court would result in Jacob Zuma essentially kicking the can down the road and the money never being recovered. And the other thing to remember, John, as well, is that multiple cost orders have been made against him. And there is no evidence, at least that I'm aware of, that he has actually necessarily paid those legal costs in relation to the cost order that was granted against him in the state capture litigation. And there was a big battle over that VBS situation, which has resolved itself to some degree. But there are a lot of people that are owed a lot of money by Jacob Zuma, and it's going to be essentially a race to see which of those people or government departments chooses to go after him. Because I think the DA's anxiety is that if the court grants this order, it may be in the government's, the government may want this whole thing to go away and simply will decide not to chase him for that money, even though they can.
Yeah, and he says, even if you attach my pension, I wouldn't be able to pay it. And I don't know what the value of his pension fund is, but there's been reporting recently about some argument in the Didi Mabuza family over his 44 million rand pension fund. And he was a premier, provincial premier, and a vice president. Jacob Zuma was a president. So, And immediately and maliciously you think, well, his probably pension fund must be somewhere akin to the Mabuza sum, and therefore pay the 28.9 and you've got 15-16 million rand left. I wouldn't mind having 16 million rand on which I could retire. Thank you very much.
That being said, of course, we know from the Shabir Sheikh trial, and that was, of course, many years ago, multiple decades ago, that Jacob Zuma, as emerged from that picture, was simply incapable of managing his own finances, and that was why Sheikh was able to pay everything from his kids' school fees to, grocery payments for Christmas. Now, obviously, when he elevated into his position as president, that situation would have changed substantially. But I think there's a big question mark as to what his financial status is, and given that he's repeatedly told the public that he would have to sell his, I think it was socks and shoes in order to fund his litigation in that corruption trial, but nonetheless has a very high-powered legal team that, launches multiple futile allegations at least three or four times a year, he's clearly getting money from somewhere. The exact source of that finance and whether it translates into someone who would potentially pay this enormous debt for him, should the court make the ruling, I think remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Karyn Maughan of News 24.